To jump right into it with dialogue, we're looking at almost every screenplay has dialogue in it. When cinema started out, it was silent film. So they used to have sometimes the title card that would have a couple of words, but a lot of films were made without any dialogue whatsoever. So your film really should be able to work without relying on your dialogue. So film is a visual medium where we're building the story visually, and the dialogue is the sprinkling on top. So if we can't find a visual way to get an idea across, then we're going to revert to dialogue. And dialogue also gives us things like, its job isn't to just explain the story. It's really about giving us insight into characters. It's about building conflict, giving us an understanding of motivation. And it can be pushing the story forward, but not through explaining it, normally through things like revelation and character interactions. So dialogue, like all screenwriting components, is a skill that can be learned and developed and improved upon. So it's the same with writing story, scene description, and setting out a screenplay correctly. It's a skill that can be learned and developed. So I'm going to just go through several different tips and points of view on how to improve your writing as a dialogue and what makes really good dialogue, and a few little tricks along the way. So the first thing I'm going to say about writing dialogue is don't write dialogue. This is the way to be a really good dialogue writer. And so for those of you who are doing my One Step-A-Day Screenplay course online, or others who have done any of my other courses or have done some other webinars, you'll know that I'm an advocate of you write your story and then you write your screenplay. And then the third step is the dialogue. So you don't want to jump straight into writing your dialogue. So we're going to look at a couple of things you want to do before doing that. And Hitchcock himself, who, was one of the great storytellers, was, said when the screenplay is written, then you write the dialogue. So we're going to work out what our story and our characters are, and then the dialogue is going to be added. So a couple of things you want to do before you start writing your dialogue. One of the most important things is your character development. Now, this is something that I have covered in a webinar, which is available on YouTube. I can send to those who didn't attend that one, looking at all of your how to develop characters. There's a few more specific things that you want to build upon, just broadly speaking, your character development and their dimensions. And what you want to work out is how does the character talk? So there's somebody who talks very short and sharp and direct. Are they someone who's more eloquent? Do they talk in a very clipped way? So just think about what's the way that they talk and express themselves. And then what we'll look at is what do they think? So what are their values and their principles? And this in particular, when we're getting into scenes, is how a character is going to respond and react, and what they're going to say is going to be based on what they think of a situation and what their value on it is. So recently I was watching, Casablanca, for those who have seen it, which is great. I mean, most dialogue isn't these incredibly memorable lines. Cinema's full of, these historic lines that we all remember that are so classic. Casablanca has a lot in that screenplay. Most don't have that, but there's the scene early on when Rick and Faraji are talking about the selling of his bar, and then he sort of says, what about Sam, who's the piano player and who works for him? Does he come with a deal? And Rick just says, I don't buy or sell people. So it's a really short line, but it's his value as a character and what he thinks on a situation. And so the reason we're thinking about what characters' values are and what they think is, what this is going to do for you is, that means that the dialogue's going to come from the inside out. So it's not just conveniently putting dialogue on a character that you need. It's going to come from that character. It's going to be authentic from what their perspective is. And it's also going to keep them consistent. So the dialogue is going to be consistent for that character, because you're going to know this is what they think, This is how they feel about situations. This is their value, and this is the way that they speak. Obviously, the way they speak to different characters will vary in certain contexts. As we talked about with character dimensions, the way they talk with their child will be different to their boss or a friend. But there'll be a consistency going through in how they speak. And so the other part also within that is as you're building your story, so with your characters, and then as you're building your story events, your dialogue, when you get to write it, will actually get better and better as your story gets better, because the dialogue is servicing the story, it's not driving it. So the example with that is you might be writing and developing a scene, and then you've worked out something that has to happen in your story. And you go, this is what's going to motivate the character. Now that you know what has happened in the story and what's motivating them, you know how they're going to respond and react to it. And most importantly, that can shift or change around. So that's a part of it. If your story shifts, then you suddenly might hit onto an aspect of how your story is working, and then your dialogue will change corresponding to that change in your story. So once you're working on those areas, the other parts, this is the second point, is to do research. And for those who have done in my courses, I won't know how much I love the research aspect of screenplays, because you're going to be researching lots of different things, and it really stimulates creativity and ideas for your story. So the great thing about research is it covers lots of areas. It will give you story ideas, it gives you motivation, and it's going to really help how you write your characters and their dialogue. So there's a couple of different areas of research you can be doing. So part of it will be specific to your screenplay. So that research will be, if you're writing in a particular era in history, is to go back and research what the dialogue, the way people talk, and the different words that they use in the vernacular from that period. Now, having said that, there's certain films that are historic that use modern dialogue and switch and play around with those ideas. So it doesn't have to be, it's just because you're setting it in that era. It doesn't have to be accurate for that. Either way, you want to be consistent with it. But if your goal is, I want to write a World War I film set in the trenches, you want to find about how they were talking in the trenches and what the vernacular of that era was. One of the other areas is then sort of connected to this, not so much period dramas, but to specific subcultures. So each subculture is going to have its own language and vernacular. And this could be as simple as, a gymnasium, going to the gym. So I've never actually been into the gym to pump iron, but if I was writing about that, I would go down there and just listen in to how people talk, because I don't know that well, but I know that they would have a whole bunch of language and the way that people talk and interact in that world. And when your actors get on board, that's the kind of thing they're going to be grasping or reaching at. What's this authenticity? How does someone who go, down in the gym, how do they talk to each other? That might get into them really obscure things. For example, maybe writing a story about modern witches. Modern witches are not like how they're depicted in fantasy and horror films. But I know that there's these different witches' covens around in modern society, which I know very little on, but if I was going to write on them, go and speak to them or observe and do that research to kind of find out what they think and how they talk about these topics. And the other key part is just actually eavesdropping on conversation. So part of this research doesn't have to be about, this is my specific topic, but how I write better dialogue is eavesdropping. And just because what's interesting is we hear people talking all of the time, but there's really that listening when you're in groups to how each person sounds different. How do people approach their conversations? There's some people who just got a really good turn of phrase, and then someone else is more eloquent on how they talk. So that eavesdropping is great. I mean, I love doing that in public, whether you're on public transport or in cafes and bars, which is what we all used to be able to do back in January of 2020. But back when we could do those things, these observations, you hear these great lines that people say, will just give you an insight into a character. So even there's ones who sometimes jot those lines down when you hear people saying them, you go, oh, I'm going to use that one day. That's a really interesting way to phrase something. So the next part with all of this is practice. So as I said, the dialogue is a skill that can be improved upon. So there's a couple of ways to go about practicing it. So this can either be with the screenplay you're currently writing. So you can just practice writing dialogue in the scenes. Maybe you've got a scene in there, it's a major dialogue scene. You can sit down and write it without the pressure of going, this is how it is going to be in my final screenplay. We can just sit down and go, I'm just going to write the scene to just play around and experiment with writing dialogue. And what you could even do is then come back the next day and rewrite it a different way, just to be playing around with it. I mean, you can be writing a couple of page dialogue scene. You can spend a little bit of time on it, but it doesn't have to end up in your screenplay, but it's going to get you better at writing dialogue. Or the other one is not even for your screenplay, but is just to write some dialogue scenes as practice. So you can come up with a scenario, and let's just say it's an interesting one where a couple sits down to dinner and he wants to propose to her and she wants to end the relationship. So this is what the characters know at the start of dinner, that they know that about themselves. They don't know what the other is there for. So you can just go, I'm going to write a 2 or 3 page dialogue scene of how that would play out. You know, do a little bit of work, and if it's a fresh scenario, it's not part of your screenplay, just do a little bit of sketching. You're going, well, like we just talked about, how do they think, how do they approach dialogue, and what their values are. And even to build on that, what you can do is something like, you can write it one way, and then either that day, or I like to come back the next day. In fact, I'll normally do this over 3 days. I'll come back 3 times and I'll rewrite the same scene with totally different dialogue. Just as an exercise to practice going, what's a different way I could approach this? You know, maybe in the first scenario, he instigates the conversation. You know, when he starts to propose, to talk about it, and then she's starting to get nervous, and how's she going to backpedal out of it? And then maybe the next day you rewrite the scenario where they sit down and she starts off the bat with, I want to end the relationship. So straight away, he's reacting to that. It was like, well, hang on, I was about to propose to you. Not that you would say the line, I was about to propose, but it would start to then get into this, well, hang on, I thought we're in this stage because I was just about to pull the ring out. Or maybe his line of dialogue, is that she says, I want to end this. And then maybe he just pulls the ring out of his pocket, puts it on the table and goes, well, that was a waste of money. Something like that. You just see how that would change the scenario around. And they're fun little things to do with all different bits and pieces of, you can come up with any scenario, whether it's, with a two-hander or multiple people playing out a situation. And then the next point on that is we'll talk about actually writing scenes themselves. So it is actually writing the scenes in your screenplay. So again, before we jump in writing the dialogue, what we're going to do is a small treatment of the scene. So first thing you want to do is ask yourself, what does each character want in the scene? So what are they there for? So when I use that previous example as he wants to propose, she wants to end the relationship. But you could have 5 or 6 different people in the scene, and you want to work out, what are they there for? What do they want? What do they want to get? So we call this is the character's goal in the scene. And for those who have done other courses, we know when we talk about, there's a through line or a goal through the whole story that the protagonist is after. And then in each scene, people are going to want something different, because that might not be what their greater goal is. They might be in a scene because they need to obtain a piece of information, or they need to find out if the person is lying. That might be their goal. Now, always you want these goals to be different, because it's a dialogue part of it, and we know drama is about conflict. So if all the characters have the same goal in the scene, you don't have any conflict. What that becomes is just exposition. that's just characters talking the story if they're all after the same goal. Unless it's a very quick explanation, it's like, oh, we need to go and do this. Or someone's giving a piece of information in that scene. Otherwise, we need differing points of view and differing goals. And a good example of a scene from The Sting. Has anyone seen The Sting?
Yep.
That's excellent. Great film. Should absolutely everyone, if you haven't watched it, even if you have, go away and rewatch it again this week because it's such a beautiful piece of writing. The story's amazing and the dialogue is just immaculate. But there's the classic poker scene in the film. So the setup of The Sting is that Redford and Paul Newman are these grifters who want to get revenge back on a mob boss and rip him off for $2 million. So that's what their overall goal in the story is. But the idea is they have to set up a bigger sting. It's really difficult to just go in and steal $2 million from him. And they talk about the best sting is when the person doesn't even realize it was a sting. So again, the dialogue tells us that's what their values are. Again, the best grifters, you don't even know you got grifted. So they need to set up a scenario where they can draw him into the sting. And they find out that he is on this long train trip and he's a poker player. So this poker game is set up. And what is the goals in the scene is, so Paul Newman, his goal is to get him, or Robert Shaw's character, so Lindemann, to get him to take the bait. That's what his goal in the scene is. Whereas, and Lindemann's character is to win. So Paul Newman's going in there is to take the bait. He wants the antagonist to take his bait, whereas Lindemann is in there just to win. Now, the way he's going to take the bait is he's going in there and he knows that, and I'm just joking around saying it's Lindemann because his actual name is Doyle Lonigan, but all the way through the scene, Paul Newman deliberately keeps getting his name wrong. And the way he's going to get him to take the bait is he's going to disrespect him. And he's going to be obnoxious in the scene because he knows that pride and being respected is the most important thing to him. So by disrespecting him, he's then going to draw him in to take the bait for what they're doing. He's not there to win. You think he's there to win, but he's not. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in a group chat just a little snippet from the scene. It's actually about an 8 or 9 minute scene. We won't watch all of it, but I'm just going to pull up just a little grab of it. Okay, I'll just put in a chat. So if you just want to click on it, it's just a 2 and a bit minute scene. Just have a little bit of a watch and see how those different goals are playing out. Okay, is that all? We've all finished that?
Yeah.
Great. I said it's a much longer set, and it's Newman and Robert Shaw are just incredible in it, but it's all because of this great this construction of the scene and the way it builds. It goes on, so it's about an 8 or 9 minute scene, and all the way through it, he just keeps deliberately getting his name wrong amongst all of these other things. So again, that's knowing what the character's goal is within the scene, so what they're after. And as with any character stuff, it's how they go about getting what they're after. The other big part with the scene when you're writing them is the subtext. So the subtext of the scene. So the text is what the character is saying, and this is the same in life as what the person is saying. And the subtext is, what do they really mean? And you want these things to be different. They're not going to be the same thing. If the character's saying exactly what they mean, then you need to be reworking the dialogue. And this is how humans work. It's all about what the subtext is happening. And the really good example of this, the joke is, it's kind of like when your wife or girlfriend says, no, that's fine, you can do that. And it's like the minute you hear the word fine, it does not mean fine. It means a whole other multitude of things. So one of the scenarios I really like would be, and this is the easiest 3 lines of dialogue to write in a scene. So a woman comes home from work, walks into her apartment, walks up to her husband, kisses him on the lips and says, "I love you." So really easy dialogue, 3 words, "I love you." Now, with the subtext, let's just throw it, or you can just chime in. Why might she be saying that? You can unmute yourself and throw me some suggestions. Why might she have done that?
She's got bad news to deliver.
Yep, bad news. What else?
Feeling guilty or something?
Feeling guilty. She just had sex with her boss on the photocopier at work. What else?
She might have meant it, for goodness sake. I'm a romantic here.
Okay, that. Thank you, Cheryl. It's very touching, and that is true. You might have meant it, which is touching in life, but it's the one thing in drama is when they're saying "I love you," it's never that they mean it. If they do, you want to find a different way to say it.
She could be feeling lucky because she might have witnessed something on the way back home that makes her feel that she's very lucky, and she might have seen something terrible, something tragedy at work or somewhere.
Yeah, so she's appreciating now something in her life.
Why always doubt the women?
It could be. Now, the little bit back on how you say those words is, and consistent with character. Casablanca is another really good example. So how does he say "I love you" in that when he genuinely loves her? What's the famous line?
We'll always have Paris.
You all have that, yeah. But he keeps saying to her early on, "He's looking at you, kid." So, and there's even that great bit in Empire Strikes Back when Han Solo's about to get, put into the carbonite freeze thing. Yeah, and Princess actually says, "I love you," and he just says, "I know." But that's him saying, "I love you" as well. So you find a different way. What could another reason be for doing it?
Trying to guilt him.
Trying to guilt, nice one. Maybe she wrote the car off on the way home.
Yeah, well, maybe she beats it, of course, but
maybe she is going to leave.
yeah.
Maybe she hasn't cheated. She knows he's cheated on her and she's gearing up to get revenge. So the point with these is if the actor is acting the subtext, they're saying the line, but the idea is whatever the meaning behind that line is the way they're going to act it. Because if it's out of guilt, or if it's perhaps to butter him up for something, or it's going to be about revenge, the way the actor would deliver that would be totally different. But the line is the same. So we want to be thinking about what each line in the scene is. Sorry, the subtext of each line. And I'm just going to give you a clip from Fatal Attraction, which is another great film. If you haven't seen it, check it out.
David, as part of the actual dialogue, do we need to write down the subtext guilty?
No.
So that actors know how to deliver that line?
Well, yeah, it'll be a combination. I mean, your story will have that. When your story's working, it'll come across once you know your story and you're writing your dialogue, the subtext will come across.
Okay.
And that's also part of what the director and the actor's job is, how they're interpreting and playing around with that aspect. But we would know what that setup, the story set up to the scene would tell us that, and that's part of what we will discover. But I'm now put into the group chat this scene, which is a great one from Fatal Attraction. And so if you just want to click on that, and if you just watch it, I think that one goes for about 4 minutes. And just look at what is saying and what's really going on in the scene. So if you click on that and then just mute your screen so we're not going to all hear it.
Yep.
You good?
Yeah, well done.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
Great scene. So much going on in that scene, and it's 2 people just sitting at a table.
It is.
So with that, I'll just pull the group chat down. Very clear, both characters have got very different goals and agendas that they're after. They know exactly, how they're approaching it and what they're up to. And the great bit with the subtext in that's a scene that is about seduction. But that word is never ever used in the scene. What's the word that they use instead of seduction in there?
Discretion, discreet.
Discreet. This is what's so great. We're talking about being discreet, and he thinks it's about, you're discreet with your work, confidentiality with your legal clients, but it's talking about seduction. If we go and have sex, I won't tell your wife, will you? I'm down for this. So there's so much going back and forth. And I won't, in the One Step-A-Day Screenplay, there's one of those steps that I look at with the how to write your screenplay, a really long, detailed analysis, because the scene has so much going on in it. We can talk about that for an hour in and of itself. But the key bit, and I encourage you to watch it again after this or later, is just to see how we get that conflict and those different agendas playing out in the scene. And the other important bit about that is dialogue is about action reaction, which we also see in this scene. So it's not just kind of I'm talking. It's like character says something, another character reacts. This character reacts to that, and we got this back and forward. So we're finding this rhythm in the scene. It's not just going, I'll give you my bit of dialogue, you give me your bit, and then I'll give my bit. It's got to feel like it's action, reaction, and spontaneous and building. And where we see variations on this, which becomes a problem, but it's used a lot in these crime shows like CSI and a lot of them, and it's whenever they have sort of the squad meeting and there's 6 actors standing around and they all get their line of dialogue. So they've got to all give them one, and you watch it and one of them will go, oh, well, he saw him, he was driving this sort of car, and someone will go, well, this sort of car can be bought from this sort of place. And someone goes, well, if it's in that place, then there'd be a camera out there. And then someone says, well, I can go down to here and find the camera. And then someone else goes, okay, well, I'll go off and have a look at that dealership. And then someone says, oh, I'll look at his criminal record. They're just giving out all these little bits of information. And you can have a little bit of that, but it gets tedious. The best dialogue is when we've got this conflict going back and forward. So just think about that action, reaction, and conflict. Because as we know as writers, conflict is drama. And once you've written these scenes, the next key bit is to rewrite dialogue. So we know that you're going to be rewriting aspects of your screenplay, and you want to be rewriting your dialogue. So because you've written it once, don't be attached to it. That reworking can be totally changing it, changing aspects. But the one thing you absolutely want to do, especially if after your first draft, and I will absolutely guarantee you, is that you will have too much dialogue. So the most common thing with all screenplays is dialogue needs to get shorter. So some of you know my rule of a second draft is your first draft minus 10%. So automatically, if you cut something back, it is going to get better almost always, but definitely with early drafts. And the same with dialogue. Cutting it back, it will get better. You're always going to have more dialogue than you need. Sometimes people are going to say cutting 20% of your dialogue out will improve it. And I know the feeling is it's like, oh no, hang on, now it's not going to work. The scene isn't going to work. I'm going to miss important information. But by cutting it back, you're just finding a more concise way to get it across. And there always will be, sometimes it just becomes down to additional words. So it's one of those things, it's kind of like actors will be able to express, so when you always see the line of like at the start and it's like, oh, really? Is the response to it? 9 times out of 10, you don't need that because the actor's response physically will be skepticism and then they'll say their line. But a lot of the other times it'll just be that whole, if it's taking you 12, 15 words to say it, it's probably a way that you're going to be able to say it in 6 or 7. And another little trick, and even though I'll say I hate, like Twitter's one of the worst pieces of social media, but one of the good things is imagine if each piece of dialogue is written as a tweet. The one thing about Twitter is it forces you to be concise. And that scene we're just watching from Fatal Attraction, you'll see that there's short dialogue back and forward. There's not these long blocks of text. So much happens. We get so much information in that scene. We learn a lot about the characters, but it's these short lines back and forward. Are you discreet? Am I? Am I what? Discreet. Yes, I am. Where's your wife? Ah, she's in the country. You know, it's his reaction that he's forgotten that he has a wife. She's in the country with my, kids. Those sorts of back and forth moments. So cutting it short will make a huge difference. And especially if you have these long chunks, if you've written a 3-page dialogue exchange, unless you can write that as well as Woody Allen or Tarantino's a great dialogue writer as well, producer's going to read it straight away and go, 99.9% of people can't write 3-page dialogue exchanges that are going to work that well, or certainly as a long spiel in and of itself. A couple of other little tips when you've got it to improve it is either to get some actors. This is when you've got a draft together, get some actors, or people can act a little bit at least, to read your scenes. So when you hear them out loud, that's when you start to go, that bit's not working. And then you'll definitely realize that you've got too much as well. And I just know this one for experience. Every time I'm in not auditions, in rehearsal of a film, we're always cutting dialogue back, even when we think it's really tight. So hearing that out loud, it also just helps you when you hear it, how it actually, how it's actually playing, because it might not be actually what's clear. Because one of the tough bits we know with writing is what's in your mind might not be coming out on the page. It's clear to you, but it's not clear to who's actually, reading it or what's on the page. And another trick even with that is just to read the dialogue yourself out loud. So sometimes when I was a co-writer I was working with on a web series a few years ago, and there was a scene in it that had written, and then she just said, I'll read that line out loud to me. And as I read it out, I was like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. So just a really simple thing, once I read it out loud and you go, because on the page, it can read differently. Having said that, make sure you get some people, it's good if they can act a little bit or they know what they're doing, or you get them to read it a couple of times. So sometimes if they're doing a main dialogue scene and they run it, and you're going to go, actually, maybe just try reading it like that just to see how it works, because sometimes their read might be a little bit off. That's the other bit. So, and just one sec, Ian, but it's just on that final point, I even know there was a short film I was directing a few years ago, which I wasn't the writer on it, I was directing, and there was a line I didn't know how it was going to work. There was something not quite working for me, because I just went, I don't see how this is going to work in the scene. But the actress we had was really good and she made it work, because I sort of went, well, we can tweak it on set. But the way she played it, I went, actually that line totally works. So sometimes it is just about the delivery. But often you'll just hear how long, because part of it is when people start talking the dialogue, you suddenly go, I thought that was concise, but they've been talking for 40 seconds straight with this simple idea. But Ian, what were you going to ask?
I'm just the way we speak is different to the way we write. This isn't it? Like, if you said, if I wrote something, I'd say he is the best player in the soccer team. But if I spoke that, I'd say he's the best player. That's all I need to say. Is what you mean, isn't it?
Perfect example.
You wouldn't say he is or whatever.
Yeah. There's a little bit, he's like, yeah. And then that's actually a really good example. You've just cut a couple of words out and tightened it up, and you're getting those things that are playing out all the way through your screenplay. Tightening up there, but also the tightening up will just become about going, well, what do the characters want in the scene, and what's the purpose of the scene in my story? Because sometimes there might be just dialogue and stuff drifting in that you go, we don't need that in this scene. We're going to pick that information up later. So that's a bit about just going how we get concisely what's needed in that scene. And again, it's a really common thing with writers. They just, they'll take 3 sentences to say what needs to be said in one. But that's also why you're drafting. It gets draft by draft, it gets tighter and tighter, the dialogue. So that's why it's just really good to embrace that idea of knowing it will get better as I keep drafting it. And just the final tip on that, this is one of the most important things you can do, is to read screenplays that have already been written. So there's a bunch of really good screenplay sites online, free screenplays. So you can look up specific films that you like. And so if you just type that title and free screenplay, otherwise there's a really good website called Drew's Scriptorama, which I'll put a link in a moment for you. Actually, I'll just type it in the chat quickly.
Yeah, there's an excellent script of Pulp Fiction, which is a great script to read.
Which one is that, sorry?
Pulp Fiction?
Oh, yeah. I've read that a long time ago, but so it's something like that. I don't remember, but if you look up Drew's Scriptorama, and there's another one called Daily Scripts. And the thing is I might encourage you to read them because you're seeing how it looks on paper, and also how concise or the type that's written. Because watching film, obviously we watch a lot of films and TV, and we're understanding how dialogue works. But when you go back and watch the script, you see how it's gone from how little there is on the page, because actors are filling in a lot of the space. So what it is you sometimes think there's a lot more being said, but it's just for absorbing that information is because they're acting the subtext and the dialogue. And as I always say, for any aspect of screenwriting, reading screenplays is a great way to learn. But if you read through scripts and you just see how that dialogue exchange plays out, how they're writing it, all those little sort of tricks or quirks that they're using, that will improve. I would say in general, if you go out and read 10 screenplays in 2 weeks, that'll improve your skills as a writer straight away. Okay, like all these topics, there's so many kind of areas to go into, but that's sort of a key seven aspects to look at. So just go if there's any questions on any of those points or other aspects of dialogue or writing, fire away.
How would you go about researching how soldiers spoke in the trenches?
With that, I'd be looking at historical documents. So that's one of the good things is, I mean, there's no voice recordings that I'm aware of how they speak exactly. But you would have a look at historical documents recently, at least kind of go, well, that's how they refer to tactical movements or pieces of equipment. It's lucky with World War II because I was watching Band of Brothers recently, which is brilliant. And that all feels very authentic, the way that's written. But, you know, a lot of the guys depicted in that, or a bunch of them were still alive. So, so yeah, whatever historical documents you can find. I mean, Ian, so you're in just explain what, you don't have to give your story away, but you're doing a similar thing with historical stuff now, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to bring forward the vernacular for the period, the way people understand. English language is a very diverse language full of colloquialisms, idioms. And I'm dealing with, like, in the 19th century, the word bloody was a fairly bad word to use. If you use the context of the 21st century, everybody think, oh, you know, that's not too bad. You'd have to substitute an F word or a C word or something to get the same impact, the use of that word. So that's why I asked you the question before, because I want to get some view of the what's happening historically, the way people talk to each other. But I realised the mid-19th century, the way the English lower classes talk wasn't understood by the educated middle class. That they actually had to write dictionaries so that the judges could understand what the criminals were talking about. So, and then writing that in a 21st century.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And on that, I mean, part of that accuracy, for anyone who's watched the TV series The Wire, which is a great example, and they've done so much research, and, you know, all the detectives talk like detectives, and all of the street language. You know, some people are saying that one of the actors was saying when they got the screenplay, it actually had a glossary of terms for the street language so people could understand them. But on your question of going, Ian, you're saying you're using that type of language if different classes use a different language, do you mean? Or
yeah, for example, people came from the north of England, like say Lancashire, Yorkshire, and they went to court and were heard by a middle class magistrate who was educated and grew up in London. didn't have a clue what they're talking about. And yet they're both speaking English.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great scene in and of itself. Is it just playing out like that, whether it's like they start talking and the judge or whoever's like, I've got no idea what he's saying, and then they've got to try and find a common language on what's happening would be a really interesting scene.
Well, that was confused by, say, in Australia, for example, when there was when they started communicating with the black people, they had this pidgin English, and that pidgin English was also substituted for the language with immigrants who came to the country from, say, Italy or France, or a lot of those people weren't educated, and they actually, that pidgin English was used by more than just with the Indigenous Australians, but with many people came to Australia from Europe.
Okay, yeah.
So that's pretty. I wanted to develop that along that way so people understood. Gee, it wasn't really so easy.
Yeah.
These people had a common purpose, quite often had a common goal, but how they expressed that was quite differently.
Yeah.
And that sounds more complex than what it should be. People won't understand what you're talking about.
Okay, well, I guess it would, there's a couple of things. I mean, you can either see, to me, just throwing ideas around that the moments when, like I just said, the characters don't get what they're talking about and they need to find a common language. Or possibly, again, if we want to show something about character, let's just say it's that's already happened, that they've got the common language between them. But we, for example, just say it's a higher class person and they're talking a certain way. And then when they interact with someone else on that different class, they can alter the way they talk to them, which shows that they're kind of streetwise, or, you know, they understand those different areas. So they might be able to straddle both of those communities, which could be an interesting way to play it. But also, I mean, it's, as long as it's interesting, like for those who have seen Clockwork Orange or particularly read the book, I mean, they created a language for that. It's an English language book. But for those who have seen it, they're using all this dialogue and all these words and terms they've made up. But over time, we start to understand them and how they play out. So,
a lot of those words still exist today. I mean, the thing which amused me was the expression "Tom Tits," which if you're Australian, you probably understand what that means. You sort of know, don't give me the shits.
yeah.
But that was an expression which was an Australian expression from the mid-19th century. It was quite in common use, which surprised me. I thought it was a much more modern term.
Okay.
And there are a lot of words which do come forward as still used, except in daily dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting bit. And a lot of Shakespeare wrote are now just common. People wouldn't realize how many common terms Shakespeare came up with in his play. Or 1984, which, you know, all of that dialogue gets used all the time. One of the other functions, again, with different genres is for how you can use it comedically, and kind of what Ian's talking about. There's a great scene in Monty Python's The Holy Grail. And they flip that, and there's the scene when it's the two peasants who are farming on the land, and they're having this really deep socio-political conversation about the nature of what a monarchy and who a leader is and all this stuff going on. And so the joke is, it's like they actually wouldn't have the education or understanding to play, you know, in that context. So they're just playing around with a comedic sense. And another one, just on Ben's question of the research, for anyone who saw the horror film, came out about 4 or 5 years ago, called The Witch, which I got to say didn't do much for me as a horror film. I thought it was pretty dull, but it was set in specific community in America, I think in early 1800s. I can't remember the date exactly. But all the dialogue in that is very specific to the era. And I read an interview with the writer who actually just looked at all the manuscripts from the court cases around that time. So they were able just to have a look at what the language was used in that era and just transpose that into the film, because there is partly a court hearing that's going on, but then it is used for the rest of the story. Any other questions?
I don't know whether you covered this, but the use of voiceover is a substitute for dialogue or developing something in a scene?
Yeah, on that, one thing you don't want voiceover to do is just the explaining the story and what's happening. So with that, we get something where we want it to be adding other levels, whether it's perspective. Apocalypse Now, I think that's one of the great uses of voiceover, because we're just getting different perspectives on what he thinks. The trick is your film should still work if you took the voiceover out. Stand By Me is another really good example. We get these different things about what the character thinks, but if you pull the voiceover out and your story doesn't work, then you got a problem. Because what that's doing is that's just explaining. It's like an audio book now.
Yeah, so if you're doing a backstory, the backstory would have to stand up without should be able to stand up without the voiceover.
Yeah, because otherwise what it turns into is just, these characters are just, or the voiceover is just explaining stuff rather than, a counterpoint. Whereas you get something like, Woody Allen uses it, but it's sort of in a comic or neurotic way, so it's a style. But if you've just got this voiceover that's just explaining all these events in the story, then you actually want to see those events. So that's why Apocalypse Now is a really good study of that. So he talks about, people he's killed in the past, but we also we know that he's a tortured soul, and we see him kill a couple of people. So we know that he's someone capable of that, for example. So Vikrant, did you have a question?
Yes, David. When you're writing for people from two different cultures, like the story that I've been working on.
Yes.
So when someone comes from different culture and then interacts with the people in different culture, but they're actually kind of working for the same goal, what tips you think should be, like, what careful things should be kept in mind so as to make sure that the story doesn't kind of goes off the track?
I think what was that, sorry? It just broke up a little bit. How to keep it so it doesn't go off track when they're... Okay.
Yes.
So I would... The thing is, again, you got to work out in your story, if that's two characters doing that, then that might be what their goal is in the scene. How do we come about having a shared dialogue between each other? A good example, has anyone seen, what's the TV series set in the gold mine days? The American one on HBO. I've had a total mental blank. Something Wood, what was it called? I'll have to come back to you with that one. But it's Deadwood, that's the series. If anyone's seen Deadwood, there's this great stuff where there's two characters who don't speak the same language. So it's Ellsworthian and the Chinese guy. And they come up with this shared dialogue between each other, which is about the San Francisco guy. So if you watch some scenes on that, but if you're having a look at a way that you just go, I would find an efficient way to get in and for them to find what their common dialogue will be. And then, move on. I wouldn't kind of go every time they talk, they have to find what the common word is or the common dialogue. I would sort of go, we'll set up, and that's part of those worlds coming together. And then they'll be able to move on collectively with that, if that makes sense.
At places we can kind of use two different languages as well for some parts.
Yeah. Well, it depends who they're talking with. So,
yeah.
I mean, it was I was actually watching Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom last week, and there's the great scene on the wooden rope bridge, and there's a bit where Indy says something, whether it's in Cantonese or Mandarin, to Short Round. When he's the scene where he's getting ready to cut the rope. And he says whatever to him, and Short Round just turns to the girl and just says, "Hang on, lady, we're going for a ride." And then bang, he cuts it. So we get what we need. That's really like two lines really efficient. And we get that in the moment. But I would just go, because drama is about overcoming, it's conflict and achieving a goal. So part of that development of the story and the arc is, if it's two characters who can't communicate them learning how they're going to communicate. Anyway, I need to get going. So thanks very much for that. So any follow-up questions, just let me know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, mate. Guys.
See you guys.